Ma'am, according to state law, you now owe me $350 in unpaid rent for occupying my storage space. Those words transformed the smuggest HOA board member I'd ever encountered into a speechless, red-faced woman in under 3 seconds. For 8 long years, this individual had terrorized our quiet suburb, wielding violation notices like weapons and treating residents' private property as her personal domain. What she never anticipated was that her entitled actions had legally established her as my tenant under residential property laws. Share your most outrageous HOA experiences in the comments. I love hearing these stories, and they sometimes inspire my property rights consulting work. By the 5th day of our standoff, she was desperately offering to pay monthly storage fees just to retrieve her luxury sedan. Let me walk you through exactly how this neighborhood dictator's arrogance became her ultimate undoing. The setup, afresh. Start gone wrong, I'm Marcus, and 4 months ago I was a 35-year-old network security consultant rebuilding after a difficult separation. My late aunt had willed me her charming ranch-style home in Willowbrook, a 1960s single-story with green trim and a standalone garage that carried the perpetual scent of machine oil and decades of stored holiday decorations. The smell transported me back to childhood visits, watching my uncle tinker with engines while Christmas lights gathered dust on overhead shelves. Moving in was supposed to mark a new beginning, a chance to heal financially and emotionally in a peaceful neighborhood. The property was ideal except for one significant complication: the homeowners association. Enter Sandra Mitchell, 54 years old, serving her 9th year as HOA vice president, treating her authority like a divine mandate. She piloted an immaculate silver Lexus SUV that gleamed under streetlights, occupied the most imposing residence on Maple Street, and maintained a rigid blonde hairstyle that defied natural physics. I'm convinced that woman's coiffure required structural engineering principles to maintain its perpetual perfection. But Sandra's true danger lay not in rule enforcement. She weaponized regulations with surgical precision. Her pattern was unmistakable: target anyone who challenged her vision of suburban conformity. Single mothers, retirees on modest incomes, the young Vietnamese family whose children's laughter apparently violated her noise standards. Anyone failing to meet Sandra's exacting standards received her special attention. First contact, an unwelcome introduction. My initial confrontation with Sandra occurred 72 hours after unpacking. While troubleshooting server connectivity issues for a demanding client, I heard her Lexus engine purring in my driveway. Perhaps she's offering a neighborly welcome, I thought optimistically. Maybe homemade cookies or community information. Walking outside, I discovered her vehicle parked directly inside my detached garage. Not adjacent to it, not blocking the entrance, completely inside the structure. She stood there in designer khakis and a pristine navy blazer, gripping her infamous clipboard while examining me like I was trespassing on her property. "Pardon me," I said, attempting diplomacy since I was new and hoped to avoid immediate conflict. "But that's my storage building." She glanced up from her documentation, and I caught a whiff of her signature fragrance, an overwhelming botanical, a salt that probably cost more than my weekly food budget. "Emergency board session," she declared as if this explained her presence. "Your parking area was most convenient." The sheer presumption was staggering. "I need access to my tools for a work appointment. Would you mind relocating your vehicle?" Sandra's heels clicked across the concrete as she brushed past me, completely disregarding my request. "I'll move it when it suits me," she announced dismissively. "Perhaps you should cultivate more civic-mindedness." Without further discussion, she departed, abandoning her Lexus in my garage like she held the deed. 7 hours. For 7 full hours, her automobile occupied my space while I couldn't access camping equipment, workshop tools, or any stored belongings. A client meeting required rescheduling because essential equipment remained trapped behind her vehicle. When Sandra finally returned, she offered no apologies or acknowledgement, acting as though graciously removing her car from my property was a generous favor. That evening, standing in my aunt's kitchen beside her framed photograph, I felt like I was already dishonoring her memory. She'd been formidable, The type of woman who'd battled city bureaucrats to install proper lighting throughout our neighborhood in the 1980s. What would she think of her nephew being steamrolled by some self-appointed suburban empress with delusions of authority? The grinding sound of Sandra's tires on gravel as she finally departed echoed in my head, mixing with the lingering chemical sweetness of her cologne throughout my garage. This confrontation communicated everything about my new neighbor. The war had officially begun, and she had no idea she'd chosen the wrong opponent. Escalation. The violation. Blitz dawn brought 3 fluorescent yellow citations adhered to my entrance, like scarlet letters of suburban shame. My morning coffee was still brewing when I peeled them off. The moisture made the ink slightly blurry, but couldn't obscure Sandra's handiwork. Citation 1. Unauthorized mailbox pigmentation. Apparently, my aunt's basic black postal box violated obscure covenants regarding earth tone harmonization with neighborhood visual standards. $50 penalty. Citation 2. Excessive window treatments. My bedroom window coverings allegedly contradicted community visibility requirements. Another $50 assessment. Citation 3. Improper refuse container positioning. My garbage bin supposedly sat 6 inches too close to the curb. Predictably, $50 more. Each violation included a standard 10-day compliance period and a handwritten message in Sandra's flawless penmanship. Welcome to Willowbrook. Standards matter here. The passive-aggressive smiley face she'd sketched made my blood pressure spike dangerously. The investigation begins revenge requires meticulous documentation. Rather than storming over to Sandra's mansion as she likely expected, I opened my laptop and began researching. The rhythmic keyboard clicking at 6:30 a.m. probably disturbed my neighbors, but I was determined to understand my adversary. Initial discovery. Sandra had filed all 3 violations on the identical date as our garage confrontation. Purely coincidental, I'm sure. Second revelation. According to the HOA management firm's online system, board members required majority approval before issuing violations. Sandra's citations were filed unilaterally, with no documented board authorization anywhere. This led to my most significant finding. I contacted the management company directly, and after 20 minutes of muzak that sounded like elevator jazz composed during a fever dream, I connected with a weary-sounding representative named Michelle. Hello? I'm calling about violation. Notices I received. I wanted to verify proper filing procedures. Of course, dear. What's your street address? After providing my information, I heard typing sounds. That's unusual, Michelle observed, her frown audible through the phone. These violations were submitted by Sandra Mitchell, but there's no record of board approval. Actually, examining her submission history, this appears to be a recurring pattern. My coffee grew cold as Michelle explained that Sandra had been issuing unauthorized violations for months, possibly years. The management company processed them automatically, assuming proper board approval existed, but recent audits triggered by resident complaints revealed Sandra operating like her personal citation factory. So these violations are invalid? I asked. Technically correct. Unofficial advice. Always request receipt documentation for HOA penalties. Many board members pocket that money rather than depositing it in community accounts. Important tip. Always demand itemized receipts for HOA fines and verify board authorization through your management company. Unauthorized citations occur more frequently than most residents realize. The garage gambit continues. Sandra wasn't finished with me. While I drafted a professional yet firm email to the board demanding dismissal of her fraudulent violations, I heard that familiar Lexus purr in my driveway. Peering through my window, there she was again, driving straight into my garage as if she possessed ownership rights. This time she abandoned all pretense of emergencies. She simply parked, exited, and left another handwritten note beneath my windshield wiper. Complaints will be documented in your permanent record. Community cooperation is mandatory. The audacity was genuinely impressive. Here I was documenting her violation of actual statutes, and she responded by trespassing on my property again, while threatening me with some imaginary permanent file like we were in elementary school. But Sandra had committed a crucial error. I'd installed a comprehensive security camera system immediately after moving in. Nothing elaborate, just standard wireless units purchased online. Footage of her initial garage invasion had been useful for personal records, but this second incident was pure evidence gold. I now possessed documented proof of trespassing, evidence of retaliatory harassment, and a clear pattern of Sandra treating my private property like her personal parking facility. More importantly, I had timestamps demonstrating she was utilizing my storage space without authorization while simultaneously filing fraudulent violations against me. That night, sitting in my aunt's weathered recliner reviewing footage and documentation, I could almost hear her voice. "Marcus, dear, bullies only understand one language: strength." The coffee stains on my laptop screen from days of late night research couldn't hide the truth. Sandra thought she was playing chess while I fumbled with checkers. She had no idea I was about to revolutionize the entire game. The reinforcements arrive. 2 days later, Sandra summoned her reinforcements. 3 other wives who apparently had nothing better to do than terrorize neighbors for entertainment. First came Rebecca, Sandra's deputy, driving a pearl-white Mercedes and carrying what resembled an official inspection checklist. She spent 25 minutes photographing my lawn with crime scene investigator dedication. My grass was allegedly inconsistently maintained according to some obscure covenant subsection I'd never encountered. Next appeared Monica, clipboard ready, measuring my outdoor pathway lighting with an actual ruler. They were apparently 1 inch too elevated and cast non-compliant shadows on the sidewalk. I observed this performance from my kitchen window while eating lunch, wondering if these women had ever considered pursuing actual hobbies. The finale featured Diane, who spent 20 minutes photographing my mailbox from every conceivable angle, like she was documenting evidence for an international tribunal. The minor dent from where the previous owner had accidentally backed into it constituted neighborhood aesthetic deterioration. By midday, I had 3 additional violation notices, $50 each naturally. Sandra's personal signature adorned every citation, accompanied by another passive-aggressive note. Community standards benefit everyone. Compliance protects property values. Building the alliance, Sandra's strategy backfired spectacularly. While her inspection squad played property detective, I was constructing my own network. Turns out I wasn't the only target of the Willowbrook Enforcement Brigade. Mrs. Patel, my 76-year-old neighbor, knocked on my door that afternoon carrying a manila folder thick enough to stop ammunition. Her hands trembled slightly, not from age but from suppressed fury. "You want to understand Sandra?" she said, settling into my aunt's kitchen chair. "Let me show you what she's done to us." The folder contained 24 months of violation notices, $50 fines for everything from excessive decorative lawn ornaments to unauthorized wildlife feeding stations. Mrs. Patel and her spouse had paid over $2,800 in fraudulent fines before their daughter intervened and threatened legal action. But Mrs. Patel wasn't alone. She introduced me to the Martinez family, who'd been repeatedly fined for their children's toys being visible in their own backyard. And to Robert Thompson, a 67-year-old veteran who'd accumulated hundreds in fines because Sandra decided his service animal's water dish was an unapproved outdoor installation. The pattern was unmistakable. Sandra targeted anyone who didn't conform to her suburban perfection standards. Elderly residents, families with children, anyone who appeared different or lacked resources to fight back. She was conducting systematic harassment masquerading as HOA enforcement. The legal discovery. That evening, while researching property law out of desperation, I stumbled across something called adverse possession statutes. More importantly, I discovered references to involuntary tenancy and landlord abandonment regulations. The legal concept is straightforward. If someone uses your property repeatedly with your knowledge, and you don't immediately take action to remove them, the law can consider them a tenant with actual legal rights. More bizarrely, if that tenant leaves personal property on your premises, specific landlord-tenant laws activate. I spent the next 4 hours in a legal research rabbit hole that would impress any law student. My laptop screen glowed in the darkened kitchen while I navigated statute after statute, cross-referencing case law and precedents. The aroma of reheated takeout mixed with the faint scent of my aunt's lavender dish detergent still lingering in the sink. Then it struck me like lightning. Sandra had been using my garage repeatedly. She'd stored HOA materials and personal items there. I had security footage documenting her access and usage. Under state law, her repeated use of my property, combined with storage of personal belongings, could legally establish a landlord-tenant relationship. This meant Sandra Mitchell, royal vice president and neighborhood tyrant, had accidentally become my tenant, and she was completely unaware. The irony was delicious. She was attempting to control my property through fraudulent violations, while simultaneously creating a legal situation where I could control her through actual tenancy law. Leaning back in my aunt's chair, listening to the old house settle around me, I smiled for the first time in weeks. Sandra thought she was playing chess while I struggled with checkers. She had no idea I was about to overturn the entire board. The nuclear option Sandra's next move was absolutely devastating. 4 days after her inspection team finished their terror campaign, I received a knock that chilled me to the bone. Standing on my porch was a municipal building inspector with clipboard, hard hat, and an expression suggesting my day was about to deteriorate significantly. "Mr. Williams, I'm here regarding a complaint about an unpermitted structure and potential zoning violations." My heart sank. "I'm sorry, what?" The inspector, a middle-aged man named Rodriguez, consulted his documentation. "We received a report that you're operating an illegal business from your garage, violating residential zoning regulations. Also, allegations of structural modifications without proper permits." I stood there in my wrinkled work shirt, trying to process what I was hearing. The morning air carried the scent of fallen leaves and approaching disaster. "Business? What business?" "IT consulting. According to the complaint, you've made unauthorized modifications, including additional electrical work and ventilation systems." The pieces assembled like a malicious puzzle. Sandra had contacted the city, fabricated lies about me operating a business from my garage, and was attempting to have my property condemned. This woman had escalated from petty HOA harassment to potentially making my home uninhabitable. But here's the advantage of being an IT professional. We're exceptional at documentation. "May I ask who filed this complaint?" I said, already knowing the answer. Rodriguez flipped through his papers. "Sandra Mitchell, HOA board member." She provided a quite detailed report with photographs and timestamps. Naturally, I spent the next hour walking Rodriguez through my property records. My garage was constructed in 1961, fully permitted and documented, in the city's own archives. I accessed the original construction permits on the city website while Rodriguez observed, his expression shifting from official skepticism to professional irritation. "These records show the garage was legally constructed," he said, comparing his paperwork to my screen. "And I don't see any evidence of commercial activity." Then I showed him something that made his jaw clench. Sandra's complaint contained multiple, demonstrably false statements, not just incorrect but intentionally fabricated. She'd claimed I'd added electrical outlets for industrial equipment when the outlets were original to the 1961 construction. She'd reported commercial-grade ventilation systems that were actually just the standard garage door opener my uncle had installed in the 1980s. "Mr. Williams," Rodriguez said, closing his folder with a decisive snap. "Filing false reports with the city is a serious offense. This complaint appears to contain multiple deliberate inaccuracies." But Sandra wasn't finished. While Rodriguez completed his inspection, whose silver Lexus came gliding into my driveway? Sandra herself, probably expecting to witness my garage's condemnation. Instead, she walked into a scene where a city inspector was documenting her false statements. "Mrs. Mitchell," Rodriguez called out as Sandra approached, "I need to discuss this report you filed." The color drained from Sandra's face faster than water through a funnel. "Oh, well, I was just concerned about community safety and property values. Your report claims unauthorized electrical work, but city records show all electrical was installed during original construction. You also reported commercial ventilation that doesn't exist. Can you explain these discrepancies? Sandra began stammering about just trying to help and maintaining community standards, but Rodriguez wasn't accepting it. He explained that false reports waste city resources and can result in financial penalties. Watching Sandra squirm under official scrutiny was like watching a vampire encounter sunlight. All her confidence evaporated the moment she faced someone with actual authority who wasn't intimidated by her clipboard. The legal consultation. That night, I called my friend Derek, a lawyer who owed me a favor from when I'd restored his office network during a ransomware attack. I explained Sandra's escalating harassment pattern, her repeated unauthorized garage usage, and her attempts to damage my property through false reports. "Marcus," Derek said after hearing my story, "what you're describing sounds like she might have accidentally created a landlord-tenant relationship. How does that work? She's been using your garage repeatedly, storing her materials there, treating it like her own space. If you can document consistent use over time, there's legal precedent for involuntary tenancy." My pulse quickened. What would that mean? It means she could legally be your tenant. You could demand back rent, establish formal lease terms, or initiate eviction proceedings. Document everything because this could become very interesting. I hung up and surveyed my aunt's kitchen, feeling her fighting spirit flowing through my veins. The scent of her old lavender soap still lingered faintly, mixing with the smell of cold pizza I'd forgotten on the counter. Sandra thought she could destroy my life with lies and intimidation. She had no idea she'd just handed me the keys to her own destruction. The legal strategy session. The following morning, I sat in Derek's cramped law office that smelled like aged leather and fresh coffee, watching him examine printouts of my security footage and documentation. His desk was covered with law books and empty energy drink containers. "Marcus, this is actually incredible," Derek said, adjusting his glasses. "Sandra's repeated garage usage absolutely meets the criteria for involuntary tenancy under state law." He pulled out a thick legal manual and began reading. "When an individual uses private property repeatedly with the owner's knowledge, stores personal belongings on said property, and establishes a pattern of regular access, the law may recognize an implied landlord-tenant relationship." My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying Sandra Mitchell has been your unauthorized tenant for 7 weeks and doesn't even realize it." Derek grinned like a predator. "Better yet, she's been storing HOA supplies in your garage. Under landlord-tenant law, that's abandoned property if she leaves it without paying rent." The legal implications hit me like a freight train. "So what does that mean?" Derek started counting on his fingers. "First, you can demand back rent for her space usage. Fair market rate for garage storage is about $140 per month. She's been using your garage for 7 weeks. That's roughly $245 in back rent. But wait, there's more," he continued. "Late fees, inconvenience charges, and utility costs bring her total debt to around $350. And here's the beautiful part. As her landlord, you have legal rights to secure the property if rent isn't paid." My head was spinning. Secure the property? You can legally lock the garage with her stuff inside until she pays what she owes. It's called a landlord's lien. And if she doesn't pay within the statutory notice period, you can dispose of the abandoned property. The irony was perfect. Sandra had been using my garage like she owned it, treating me like some powerless victim. Instead, her entitled behavior had accidentally made her my tenant with real legal obligations. "But here's the most beautiful part," Derek said, examining my security footage timestamps. "Sandra's been accessing your garage using her own key." I blinked. Her own key? She had to get that key somewhere. Either she made an unauthorized copy or someone gave her access. Either way, it proves she's been treating your garage like her personal storage unit. Derek pulled out a legal form and began writing. "We're going to serve her with a formal notice of tenancy and rent demand. Certified mail. Completely by the book. She'll have 7 days to respond after receiving notice." The aroma of his coffee mixed with musty law books as Derek explained the timeline. She can pay the back rent and establish a formal lease, dispute the tenancy claim in court, or face eviction proceedings. And if she ignores it, then we file for eviction and her Lexus becomes collateral for unpaid rent. Derek's grin widened. Marcus, she walked right into the most perfect legal trap I've ever seen. I sat there in stunned silence, feeling like I'd discovered I'd been playing chess while thinking it was checkers. Sandra's harassment, her garage usage, her storage of items. It had all been building toward this moment where her behavior gave me legal power over her. Important insight. Property law is complex, but repeated use of someone's space with storage of personal items can create involuntary tenancy relationships that give landlords significant legal rights. Derek handed me the completed notice. Welcome to being Sandra's landlord, Marcus. Something tells me she's not going to handle this well. Assembling the Justice League over the next 4 days, I assembled what I fondly called my Justice Coalition, a diverse team of neighbors who'd been waiting years for someone to finally challenge Sandra's reign of terror. First recruit, Mrs. Patel, who appeared at my door with a manila folder thick enough to stop bullets and eyes sparkling with the kind of revenge only a 76-year-old grandmother can properly execute. Marcus, dear, she said, settling into my kitchen. I've been maintaining records for 24 months. Sandra targeted my rose garden, my bird feeders, even my grandson's bicycle. Time to utilize this. Mrs. Patel's documentation was remarkable. Photographs, timestamps, copies of every fraudulent violation notice. She'd even recorded some of Sandra's aggressive confrontations on her phone. The woman was essentially a one-person surveillance operation disguised as a sweet elderly neighbor. Next came the Martinez family, Elena and Diego, along with their twin 9-year-olds, who'd been repeatedly fined for the audacity of owning children's toys. Diego worked in construction and understood property law better than most attorneys. Man, what you're doing is brilliant, Diego said, reviewing Derek's legal strategy. Sandra's been acting like she owns everyone's property. Time she learned about actual ownership rights. Elena produced her own folder. She fined us $180 last month because Sophia's sidewalk chalk art was defacing community walkways. It was hopscotch squares. Then there was Robert Thompson, the 65-year-old veteran whose service dog had been declared an unapproved outdoor fixture by Sandra's twisted interpretation of HOA rules. Robert brought experience dealing with bureaucratic nonsense and unshakable composure. Son, Robert said, examining Derek's legal paperwork, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed. You're using her own weapons against her. My secret weapon was Derek's legal expertise. He spent hours walking us through landlord-tenant law, explaining our rights and Sandra's obligations in simple terms. Here's the beautiful aspect of involuntary tenancy, Derek explained to our group gathered in my living room. It's not some obscure legal loophole. It's established law designed to protect property owners from exactly this situation. He pulled out a whiteboard and began drawing diagrams. Step 1. Serve the tenancy notice via certified mail. Step 2. Wait for Sandra's response. Step 3. Document everything she does afterward. The technical preparation was where my IT background truly shone. I upgraded my security camera system, installed audio recording capabilities, and established automatic cloud backup. Every interaction with Sandra would be documented in high definition with crystal clear audio. Important tip: when dealing with property disputes, comprehensive documentation trumps everything. Courts appreciate timestamps, video evidence, and certified mail delivery confirmations. Mrs. Patel suggested coordinating our response. If Sandra retaliates against Marcus, she'll probably escalate her harassment of all of us. We need to be prepared. We created a neighborhood communication network, group text messages, shared photo folders, coordinated documentation. If Sandra tried targeting any of us, the others would immediately begin recording. Diego contributed the brilliant idea of researching fair market rental rates. If this goes to court, you want solid numbers. I know 4 different storage facilities we can get quotes from. We discovered that garage storage space in our area rented for between $135 and $155 per month. Sandra's 7 weeks of usage, plus late fees and utility costs, easily justified the $350 demand Derek had calculated. Robert suggested researching Sandra's own property for potential violations. "Know your enemy," he said with military precision. "If she wants to play by HOA rules, let's ensure she's following them herself." That investigation was enlightening. Sandra's own property had at least 5 violations she'd somehow never cited herself for. An unapproved garden shed, outdoor lighting exceeding height restrictions, and a mailbox that didn't match the approved color scheme. The psychological preparation was equally important. Derek coached me on remaining calm during confrontations, documenting everything and never losing my temper regardless of how outrageous Sandra's behavior became. "She's going to escalate when she receives this notice," Derek warned. "Expect the absolute worst behavior you've ever seen from her. But that's actually beneficial. The more unhinged she becomes, the stronger your case gets." Mrs. Patel patted my hand with the confidence of someone who'd raised 7 children. "Honey, bullies like Sandra have been getting away with their behavior. For so long they've forgotten that actions have consequences. Time to remind her." As we concluded our planning session, I looked around my aunt's living room at this unlikely alliance. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air and the determined expressions on everyone's faces. Sandra had spent years dividing and conquering this neighborhood through fear and intimidation. She was about to discover what happens when her victims finally unite and fight back with actual legal weapons. The certified mail notice was delivered on a Thursday morning at 10:23 a.m. I know this because Sandra's reaction was so spectacular that 4 different neighbors texted me the exact timestamp of when she began screaming in her driveway. The notice was beautiful in its simplicity: official letterhead, legal language, and a clear message. Notice of landlord-tenant relationship and demand for rent. Derek had crafted it perfectly, explaining that Sandra owed me $350 for her unauthorized garage usage. Sandra's first response came exactly 47 minutes after delivery. I was working when I heard her Lexus screech into my driveway, with the fury of a woman whose worldview had just shattered. The pounding on my door sounded like someone attempting to break it down. I calmly activated my security cameras, ensured my phone was recording, and opened the door to find Sandra's face contorted in a shade of crimson I didn't know was humanly possible. "This is harassment," she shrieked, waving the legal notice like it was combustible. "This is frivolous. This is insane." "Good morning, Sandra," I said with practiced calm. "I see you received the notice. You have 7 days to respond according to state law. You can't just declare me your tenant. That's not how this works." I pulled out my phone and showed her security footage of her repeated garage usage. "Actually, Sandra, that's exactly how involuntary tenancy law works. You used my property repeatedly, stored your belongings there, and established a pattern of access." Watching Sandra's entitled confidence crumble was like witnessing a controlled demolition. She'd spent so long bullying people who didn't know their rights that she'd never encountered someone who actually understood the law. "It was emergency parking," she stammered. 26 separate occasions over 7 weeks, I replied, consulting my documentation. "That's not emergency parking, Sandra. That's regular use of private property without permission." Sandra's voice reached a pitch that probably alarmed neighborhood pets. "I'll sue you. I'll have you arrested. I'll get you expelled from this neighborhood." "Feel free to call the police," I said, gesturing to my security cameras. "I'm sure they'd be interested in reviewing the footage of your repeated trespassing." That's when Sandra made her first critical error. Instead of walking away to consult an attorney, she decided to escalate. Right there in front of my cameras with perfect audio recording, she made threats that would look terrible in court. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she snarled. "I have connections. I'll make your life miserable. I'll have city inspectors here every week." I just smiled and held up my phone. "All being recorded, Sandra, but please continue." The realization that she was being documented hit her like a slap. For just a moment, her mask slipped completely, and I saw the real Sandra. Not the confident HOA enforcer, but a petty tyrant who'd never been challenged. The Scorched Earth campaign. But Sandra wasn't finished. Over the next 4 days, she launched a desperate scorched earth campaign. She filed complaints with the city about my illegal parking structure. She reported my security cameras as privacy violations. She even called the fire department claiming my garage was a fire hazard. Each complaint was more ridiculous than the last. The city inspector who'd already cleared my garage sent back a form letter essentially saying, "Stop wasting our time." The fire department found nothing wrong except Sandra's own storage violations. But Sandra's desperation really showed when she started targeting my allies. Mrs. Patel received 3 new violation notices for excessive garden ornamentation. The Martinez family got cited for unauthorized children's equipment in their backyard. Robert Thompson was threatened with fines for his service dog's water bowl. The beautiful thing was, we were prepared. Our communication network activated every time Sandra made a move. Photos, timestamps, witnesses. We documented everything with precision. Diego texted me a photo of Sandra measuring his kid's swing set with a ruler at 5:30 a.m. Mrs. Patel sent video of Sandra yelling at her rose bushes like they had personally offended her. Robert calmly recorded Sandra arguing with his service dog about municipal water regulations. But Sandra's biggest mistake was underestimating how fed up the entire neighborhood had become. Word of our legal strategy spread like wildfire. Other residents began coming forward with their own Sandra horror stories and documentation. By Monday, Sandra had managed to transform herself from the neighborhood enforcer into the neighborhood pariah. Her desperate attempts to intimidate us had backfired spectacularly, creating a paper trail of harassment that would make any attorney salivate. The scent of autumn leaves filled the air as I watched Sandra's support network crumble. Even her usual allies were beginning to distance themselves from her increasingly erratic behavior. She had 4 days left to respond to my notice. Instead of seeking legal advice, she was digging herself deeper into a hole with every desperate move. Sandra was about to learn that when you declare war on someone who knows the law, you better make sure you can win. The housing authority gambit on Wednesday. Sandra played what she thought was her trump card. I was reviewing client code when my doorbell rang to reveal a woman in a government-issued jacket holding an official clipboard. "Mr. Williams? I'm Inspector Janet Rodriguez from the State Housing Authority. We've received reports about illegal boarding house operations at this address." I blinked slowly, processing the sheer audacity. Sandra had actually contacted state housing authorities and filed false reports claiming I was operating an illegal rental operation. "I'm sorry," I said, pulling out my phone to begin recording. "But this is a single-family residence. I live here alone." Sandra's face lit up with smug satisfaction as she appeared from behind the inspector. "Then explain why you've been demanding rent from residents of this community." There it was, Sandra's trap. She thought she was being clever, using my legal notice against me. In her twisted logic, if I was demanding rent from her, I must be operating an illegal rental business. The housing inspector looked confused. "Sir, do you rent out portions of your property?" "No," I replied calmly. "But I do have an involuntary tenant who's been using my garage without permission for 7 weeks." Sandra's smugness faltered. "That's not... You can't just..." "Actually," I continued, addressing the inspector, "under state landlord-tenant law, repeated unauthorized use of private property can establish a tenancy relationship." I showed the inspector my documentation, security footage of Sandra's repeated garage usage, timestamps, photos of her personal items stored in my garage, the legal notice Derek had prepared. "This woman has been trespassing repeatedly," I explained. "My research revealed that her pattern of usage actually made her my involuntary tenant under state law." The inspector studied my documentation with growing interest. "Ma'am," she said, turning to Sandra, "did you file a false report about illegal boarding house operations?" Sandra's face went through several color changes before settling on a sickly shade of green. "I was just... community safety. He's harassing residents." "Ma'am, filing false reports with state agencies is a serious offense," the inspector said firmly. "This appears to be a private property dispute, not a housing code violation." The private investigator Sandra had apparently hired quietly began backing toward her car. Even she could see this was going sideways fast. But Sandra made her biggest mistake. Instead of cutting her losses, she doubled down with a screaming meltdown that was spectacular even by her standards. "This is all lies," she shrieked. "He's manipulating you. I'm a respected member of this community. I've been on the HOA board for 9 years. The inspector stepped back as Sandra's voice reached glass-shattering levels. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down." "I will not calm down. This man is destroying our neighborhood. He's a troublemaker. He doesn't belong here." And there was Sandra's mask completely off, her true feelings about who belonged in her neighborhood exposed, for everyone to hear. The inspector's expression shifted from professional courtesy to obvious discomfort. Mrs. Patel chose that perfect moment to walk over with a plate of cookies and a manila folder. "Officer," she said sweetly, "I have 24 months of records showing this woman's harassment of elderly residents." Behind her came Diego with his own folder, then Robert with his service dog and a stack of fraudulent violation notices. Within minutes, Sandra was surrounded by neighbors with evidence of her systematic abuse. The inspector looked around at this impromptu evidence presentation and then back at Sandra, who was still ranting about property values. "Ma'am," the inspector said to Sandra, "I think you need to leave now." As Sandra's hired help beat a hasty retreat to their cars, she made one final threat that sealed her fate. "You haven't heard the last of this. I'll have you all evicted. I'll call immigration." The inspector held up her hand. "Ma'am, stop talking. You're making this much worse for yourself." Sandra finally seemed to realize she was standing in a hole she'd dug herself, surrounded by witnesses and recording devices, having just threatened multiple residents with harassment based on perceived immigration status. The scent of autumn, air mixing with the acrid smell of Sandra's burning bridges, filled my nostrils as I watched her storm back to her Lexus. She had less than 48 hours left to respond to my legal notice, and instead of hiring an attorney, she just created enough evidence to bury herself in court. The emergency board meeting Sunday evening arrived with the finality of a judge's gavel. Sandra had exactly 12 hours left to respond to my legal notice, and instead of paying or negotiating, she'd chosen the nuclear option, calling an emergency HOA board meeting to address the crisis threatening our community. The community center was packed like a sold-out concert. 40-plus residents filled every chair with more standing along the walls. I spotted a reporter from the local newspaper in the back corner, camera ready. Word had spread about Sandra's spectacular meltdown with the housing inspector, and apparently half the neighborhood wanted front-row seats to the finale. Sandra sat at the head table with the remaining 3 board members, looking like a general preparing for her last stand. Her perfectly styled hair was showing stress cracks, and her usual confident smile had been replaced by the tight-lipped expression of someone who knows they're about to face a firing squad. "This emergency meeting," Sandra announced, her voice echoing through the room with forced authority, "has been called to address the disruptive and litigious behavior that's threatening the very foundation of our community." She gestured dramatically in my direction. "Marcus Williams has been harassing board members, filing frivolous legal claims and attempting to extort money from longtime residents through intimidation tactics." A murmur ran through the crowd. Sandra was playing to her base, trying to frame this as a community versus outsider narrative, but she'd made one crucial miscalculation. She didn't know about our documentation network. I stood up slowly, Derek beside me with a briefcase full of evidence. "May I respond to these allegations?" Sandra's smile was venomous. "Mr. Williams, this is a closed board meeting. Residents may observe but not participate unless invited to speak." "Actually," said board member Patricia Gonzalez, who'd clearly grown tired of Sandra's power trips, "any resident has the right to address the board during emergency meetings. It's in our bylaws." Sandra's face flushed red, but she couldn't argue with her own rules. "Fine, but keep it brief." I walked to the front of the room, feeling every eye on me. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, mixing with the nervous energy of 40 neighbors who'd been waiting years for this moment. "Thank you," I began, pulling out my phone. "I'd like to start by playing some audio from Friday's incident with the state housing inspector." The room went dead silent as Sandra's voice filled the speakers. "I will not calm down. This man is..." destroying our neighborhood. He's a troublemaker, he doesn't belong here. Then came the immigration threats, crystal clear and high-definition audio. The room collectively winced as they heard their HOA vice president threatening residents based on perceived immigration status in front of a government official. "That's taken out of context," Sandra shrieked, jumping to her feet. "I was defending our community." "From what?" I asked calmly. "From me legally demanding rent for your unauthorized use of my garage." I pulled out Derek's legal documentation and began reading. "Sandra Mitchell has used my garage without permission on 26 documented occasions over 7 weeks. She stored personal belongings and HOA supplies on my property. Under state landlord-tenant law, this establishes an involuntary tenancy relationship." The crowd was hanging on every word. Mrs. Patel stood up in the back, holding her manila folder, like a weapon. "May I add something?" she called out sweetly. Sandra looked panicked. "This isn't the time." "Let her speak," said board member David Kim, who'd apparently decided Sandra had dug her own grave deep enough. Mrs. Patel walked to the front with the practiced grace of someone who'd testified at city council meetings for decades. "I have 24 months of documentation showing Sandra's systematic harassment of elderly residents, families with children, and anyone she decided didn't belong in this neighborhood." She opened her folder and began reading violation notices. Excessive garden gnome displays, unauthorized bird feeding stations, improper cultural decorations during holiday celebrations. The crowd was getting restless. People were whispering, pointing, clearly recognizing their own harassment experiences in Mrs. Patel's testimony. Diego Rodriguez stood up next. "She fined us $180 because my daughter drew hopscotch squares with chalk." Robert Thompson's voice carried from the back. "She tried to make me pay $50 because my service dog's water bowl was an unapproved outdoor fixture." One by one, residents began standing up and sharing their Sandra stories. The floodgates had opened, and 9 years of suppressed anger and frustration came pouring out. Sandra tried desperately to regain control. "This is character assassination. I've served this community faithfully for 9 years. That's when the reporter spoke up. "Mrs. Mitchell, can you comment on the false reports you filed with city and state agencies?" The room erupted. Cameras were flashing. Neighbors were shouting questions. Sandra looked around wildly, realizing she was completely surrounded by hostile witnesses and documentation of her abuse. Board member Gonzalez called for order. "Given the allegations presented tonight, I motion for Sandra Mitchell's immediate suspension from the HOA board pending a full investigation." "Seconded," said Kim immediately. "All in favor?" Gonzalez called. 3 hands shot up instantly. Sandra's hand remained conspicuously down. Sandra stood there for a moment, surrounded by the ruins of her suburban kingdom, looking like a dictator who just realized the revolution had succeeded. "This isn't over," she said quietly. But her voice carried no authority anymore, just the hollow desperation of someone who'd lost everything. As Sandra gathered her things and walked toward the exit, Derek leaned over and whispered the perfect final line. "Mrs. Mitchell, you have until midnight to pay the $350 in back rent, or we file eviction proceedings first thing Monday morning." The sound of her heels clicking on the linoleum floor echoed through the silent room as Willowbrook's 9-year reign of terror finally came to an end. The midnight payment at 11:43 p.m. That Sunday night, exactly 17 minutes before my legal deadline, I heard the familiar purr of Sandra's Lexus pulling into my driveway one last time. But this wasn't the entitled Sandra who'd first invaded my garage months ago. This was a broken woman clutching an envelope like it contained her soul. Through my security cameras, I watched her walk slowly to my door. Her perfect posture finally showed the weight of her spectacular downfall. The knock was soft, almost apologetic. When I opened the door, Sandra stood there with red-rimmed eyes and an envelope in her trembling hand. "The money," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. $350 cash. I opened the envelope and counted the bills, all there, down to the last dollar. "Thank you, Sandra. This settles your back rent." She nodded stiffly and turned to leave, but then stopped. For just a moment, I thought she might apologize or acknowledge the damage she'd caused. Instead, she said, "You won't be seeing me anymore. I'm moving to Arizona next month." And just like that, Sandra Mitchell disappeared into the night, leaving Willowbrook forever. The transformation, the immediate aftermath, was like watching a neighborhood wake up from a nightmare. Within 48 hours of Sandra's resignation, the HOA board called an emergency audit of all fines collected over the past 3 years. They discovered Sandra had pocketed over $5,200 in unauthorized citations, money that legally belonged to the community fund. The management company immediately refunded every fraudulent fine Sandra had issued. Mrs. Patel got back her $2,800. The Martinez family recovered their $180. Robert Thompson was refunded for his service dog violations. Even I got back the $150 Sandra had tried to extort from me with her fake violations. But the real transformation was in the community itself. With Sandra gone, neighbors started talking to each other again. Children played in their yards without fear of violation notices. Mrs. Patel's garden gnomes returned to their posts like tiny sentinels celebrating victory. A new HOA board led by Patricia Gonzalez implemented what they called the Sandra Protocols: transparency requirements, board, vote mandates for all citations, and a community ombudsman to prevent future abuse. They even installed a suggestion box at the community center for residents to report harassment without fear of retaliation. 4 weeks after Sandra's departure, something beautiful happened. I was working in my garage finally, and completely mine, when Mrs. Patel knocked on the door. "Marcus, dear," she said, carrying a plate of homemade cookies that smelled like heaven. "We're organizing a block party for next Saturday. Will you help?" That block party became the first annual Willowbrook Community Festival. 60 families showed up. Diego brought his famous carnitas. Robert's service dog got belly rubs from a dozen kids. Even the reporter from the local newspaper came back to write a follow-up story about neighborhood healing. But the best part? We raised enough money to install a playground where Sandra's beloved aesthetic standards once prohibited children's laughter. The kids love it, and their happy screams echo through the neighborhood every afternoon like a symphony of freedom. The ripple effect: 6 months later, I got a call from a lawyer in Phoenix. Apparently, Sandra had tried her old tricks in her new Arizona community, targeting an elderly Mexican-American family with fraudulent violations. But this time her victims were ready.